Today's episode discusses suicide, alleged stalking, harassment, coercive control, and intimate partner abuse. Listener discretion is advised.
The information presented in this episode is based on publicly available records, court filings, news coverage, and family statements. This podcast is for informational purposes only. We are not law enforcement, legal professionals, or medical experts. We are not accusing anyone of any crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
A North Carolina medical examiner ruled Mica Frances Miller's death a suicide. Her family has never disputed that ruling.
What they have disputed from the day she died is what was done to her in the months before she walked into that park.
She was 30 years old. She had served her husband, a Myrtle Beach pastor, with divorce papers 2 days earlier, and she told her sister more than once that if she ever ended up dead by gunshot, it was not going to be by her own hand.
And on April 27th, 2024, she was found dead.
Hey there, I'm Ashley.
I'm Ricky.
You are listening to Crime Salad. Myrtle Beach is a crown jewel of a 60-mile stretch of continuous beach. And in April, the spring break rush is tapering off, and the family vacationers are starting to trickle in. And there's this sense of preseason anticipation while the air is warming up and the ocean is still cold. And on the oceanfront, it's fun in the sun and souvenir shops. But a 10-minute drive inland brings you to Carolina Forest, where suddenly you're in a quiet, high-end suburb. And in April of 2024, the town was right in the sweet spot. The azaleas were out, the bike rallies hadn't started yet, and the weather was perfect. Everyone was on vacation or living the dream of a permanent one. Carolina Forest is a large planned community of cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns, and large modern churches. They are social hubs with coffee shops and professional media teams. And in April of 2024, these spaces were at peak energy following Easter. A few miles south, in Market Common, the streets are built on the bones of the former Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, a polished neighborhood of boutique shopping, townhomes, and tree-lined parks where it's easy to forget what was there before.
And you can be in a $600,000 house in a gated community 1 minute, and then 10 minutes later, you're at a boat landing on the Waccamaw River where the trees are so thick that they block out the sun.
Here, it's very easy to be seen and even easier to get lost. While the rest of the city was preparing for the summer rush, one person was preparing for a journey that no one ever saw coming. Her name was Mica Acacia Frances.
And the question her family is still asking 2 years later is whether anything that happened to her in the months before her death was really her choice at all.
Mica Acacia was born on March 7, 1994 in Wichita, Kansas, to her parents Michael Francis and Angelita Ramirez. Wichita is a place with vast horizons and steady Midwestern values. It feels like a small town despite being the largest in Kansas. She grew up surrounded by a large family with a brother, Nate, and 4 sisters, Anna, Sierra, Abby, and Destiny. Family was a huge part of Mica's life and would remain constant all the way until adulthood. Mica was someone who really leaned into her role as a sister. She wasn't ever distant or disconnected from her family, but wanted to be present in everyone's lives. She was always looking for opportunities to stay connected, support her siblings, and be involved. She was energetic, adventurous, and deeply passionate. She wasn't someone who shied away from challenges or setbacks, but leaned into the experience. Mica also loved being active. She loved being outdoors and doing outdoor activities like hiking, running, going to the beach, and she even took on more intense experiences like waterfall rappelling and skydiving.
Waterfall rappelling is when you descend a vertical rock face while positioned directly within or alongside a waterfall. Sometimes it's part of a longer activity called canyoning, which strings together a sequence of descents, jumps, and swims through a canyon. Either way, it adds slippery surfaces, water pressure, and limited visibility to a normal rappel. The wet ropes are heavier and harder to handle. If you get pinned under heavy flow, the water can make it almost impossible to breathe. And if it rains upstream, the waterfall can flash flood in a matter of seconds. So this is bucket list adrenaline territory.
So obviously, she was this kind of person to push herself, to try new things, even committing to being vegan for an entire year just to see if she could do it. And that kind of personality is very all in. When she's committed to something, she's really committed. Whether it was her lifestyle, her beliefs, or her relationships, she gave it everything she had. And that same level of commitment showed up in her personal life. Mica married Pastor John Paul Miller in 2017, but their relationship went back much further. The two had been friends since 2009, when they built a connection for years before becoming husband and wife. And after they were married, Mica did what she knew how to do. She went all in. She stepped into a very active role in both her home and her church, becoming a stepmother to John Paul's children, Logan, Zachary, Eli, Asher, and Selah. According to those who knew her, she embraced that role fully. She was heavily involved in their church, Solid Rock at Market Common, where John Paul was the senior pastor. And in a lot of cases, leading at a church becomes almost like a second full-time job. She wasn't just attending, she was leading alongside John Paul. Worship leader, graphics designer, youth leader, women's ministry leader, pastor, assistant.
5 roles inside the church her husband ran. The same church where Mica would later tell police he had groomed her in the years leading up to their marriage, and where she said she had known him since she was 10 years old.
According to her friends and her family, her faith was central to who she was. She spent time praying for her family, often out loud, asking for their protection and hoping that each of them would continue to follow their beliefs. Her priorities weren't day-to-day life. They were her family, her faith, and the people around her. She was loving, giving, forgiving, and poured into the people around her with all her effort. She looked forward to hearing from her father and her brother. She made an effort to stay connected to her sisters, and she took every opportunity to support them. And even in her marriage, she made it a point to be supportive, praising her husband after every church service, encouraging him and standing beside him in both his personal life and his work. Of course, Mica enjoyed parts of everyday life, her home, her car, routines, ice baths, and using the sauna. But what mattered most to her wasn't material things. It was wanting to see people come to her faith and to live a life centered around that belief. But by April of 2024, something had clearly shifted. At some point that month, Mica placed a 911 call that was chilling. During that call, Mica asked the dispatcher a very specific question: if they were able to trace the location of her phone. The dispatcher responded, asking if she knew where she was. Mica said she was at a national park, and through the call, the dispatcher was able to determine that Mica was at Lumber River State Park.
Lumber River State Park is a stark departure from the bustling energy of Myrtle Beach. It's located about 65 miles northwest in Robeson County, North Carolina. It moves from the coast into the quiet, rural landscape that's centered on the Lumber River. It's a blackwater river stained by decaying vegetation in the surrounding swamps. It's deep, shady, and isolated, and there's lots of wildlife.
So the dispatcher kept trying to confirm Mica's exact location. She asked Mica what was going on. Mica answered that she was about to kill herself, and that she wanted her family to know where to find her.
Even at that moment, the focus was on her family. She wanted them to know where she was, and that tells you a lot about where her head was.
The dispatcher tried to call Mica back multiple times, but couldn't make contact with her. Robeson County deputies were dispatched to Lumber River State Park to check on Mica and to try to locate her before anything tragic occurred. By 3:05 p.m., contact was made with the Lumber River State Park superintendent. They requested a phone ping to try to locate Mica, dispatching a search along with state park rangers. And as they combed through the land, the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, the Aviation Division, and the UAV drones were dispatched to help. After 30 minutes with no results, the dispatcher contacted Verizon to request an updated location ping on Mica's phone. As more detectives arrived with the drone, they were approached by a fisherman in the park. His name was Johnny Jacobs. He was 55 years old, a Robeson County local, who had came out to fish whenever he had the chance. That afternoon, he had been on the water for hours when he heard something he couldn't place, crying, coming from somewhere in the woods. He listened for 2 to 3 minutes. Then a single gunshot. Then the crying stopped. Jacobs went looking. Before he found anything, he passed 3 people on a boat nearby, and he asked them if they heard the gunshot. They said they had. They said they had not heard the crying. He kept moving, and he found a fanny pack near the water's edge, 2 feet from the river. Inside was Mica's ID, her bank card, her keys, her credit cards, and a small Bible.
Now, remember Johnny Jacobs. He becomes a part of this story again later.
By 4:23 p.m., another fisherman called 911 to report a body in the water while fishing from his kayak. Deputies secured the area for investigation. By 5:30 p.m., detectives had arrived at the fisherman's location. Crime scene technicians and the medical examiner arrived shortly after, just before 6 p.m. Detectives collected evidence from Mica's car. They found a Sig Sauer gun case in the passenger seat and a box of ammunition in the center console. They also found a receipt for the handgun from a pawn shop and a receipt from a convenience store. Both were dated for the same day. Just over an hour later, detectives located the gun Mica had purchased in the water. Mica had been dead for less than 12 hours when her husband walked up to the pulpit at Solid Rock at Market Common to deliver his Sunday sermon.
12 hours, and he hadn't even canceled the service.
He preached the full service in his usual style, and then, at the very end, instead of an altar call, he made an announcement. He told the congregation he had gotten a call late the previous night. He said his wife had passed away. He said it was self-induced. It was up in North Carolina. He told them that there would be a funeral the following Sunday at 3. And then he asked them to leave the church quietly. He told them not to talk about the announcement inside the building.
Yeah, don't talk about it, from the man whose wife just died.
Now, this sermon was recorded and it quickly posted online. It was what put this case on the international map. People who had never heard of Solid Rock, never heard of Mica, never been to Myrtle Beach, watched a pastor deliver the news of his wife's death like he was announcing a church picnic. And the questions started immediately.
Then came the same obituary he wrote for her the same week. He described their marriage like it was the happiest one anyone had ever had. He wrote that Mica praised him after every church service, told him that he was the best preacher in the world, even if he wasn't. Told him he was the funniest preacher in the world, even if that wasn't true either. And during her eulogy in front of the congregation, he said he had tried to raise her from the dead.
It's been 2 days. That's how long it has been since she served him divorce papers.
Wow.
By May of 2024, Mica's tragic death had begun to ripple through her community, leaving friends, family, and members of her church trying to understand what had happened. Mica had a heart for missions. She had recently been to Africa and talked about how deeply it had impacted her, how she fell in love with the people there, and how she would do anything for anyone. She had even dreamed to open a school in Africa one day. So how could she have gone from that to this? Her husband, Pastor John Paul Miller, also spoke publicly. He described Mica as incredibly affirming, saying they would spend hours every night just talking. He said she was probably the greatest wife anyone could ever ask for. At the time, the official cause of death had not been released, but John Paul openly discussed her suicide. Some of Mica's friends began speaking out, questioning whether the situation had been fully understood. One friend even pushed for the case to be looked into more deeply, saying there was accountability that detectives were missing. A tragic life had been lost, but her friends didn't believe it was as simple as mental health issues, especially when Mica was so involved with plans for the future. John Paul, on the other hand, shared more about what he described as Mica's struggles. He said she had battled with mental illness for years and that it was something she had openly talked about even within the church. According to him, she had previously battled suicidal thoughts, and each time they had helped her through it by getting her medical care. He also said that she had shared testimonies about those experiences, explaining how she had overcome those struggles in the past. In speaking to others, he emphasized the importance of taking any signs seriously, encouraging families to seek help immediately. As more information came out in early May, the divide between the official narrative and the public perception only grew. Friends and family openly disagreed with the statement that Mica had died by suicide, and many began urging law enforcement to take a closer look at her death. That concern quickly turned into action. On May 5th, just days after her death, hundreds of people gathered outside Mica's church to advocate for her case to be examined more closely.
People didn't remember Mica as someone with no hope. They remembered her smile, her warmth, genuine kindness in every interaction. That's not the person John Paul was describing in the press.
Now, that same day, Mica's family held a memorial service in North Myrtle Beach. And during this same time, there was another memorial that was taking place, organized by John Paul Miller at Solid Rock Church. That alone tells you everything you need to know about where things stood between the people closest to her. The very next day, May 6th, authorities released a key update. They confirmed that Mica had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Officials confirmed that her death occurred on April 27th at Lumber River State Park, stating that the nature of the wound was consistent with being self-inflicted. The medical examiner addressed the speculation that had been circulating, clarifying that the wound was not to the back of her head. He also noted that while he wasn't the on-call medical examiner that weekend, he did go to the scene to assist. At the same time, Robertson County Sheriff Burris Wilkins addressed the growing public attention. He said he had scheduled a meeting with Mica's family and that he planned to release additional details about the findings, but he urged the public to wait, to hold off on making assumptions, and to let the full timeline come out before drawing conclusions. Following the growing public concern, the Robertson County Sheriff met with Mica's family and released a detailed timeline of her moments on the day she died. At 10:13 a.m., Mica was seen on her Ring camera leaving her home on Margarita Drive in Myrtle Beach. Less than an hour later, she returned home. At 11:38 a.m., she left her home for a second time. At 12:12 p.m., Mica was seen on surveillance footage walking into Dick's Pawn Shop on Mr. Joe White Avenue, where she purchased a gun. At 12:34, she left the store, now in possession of both the weapon and ammunition. At 1:06, her Honda Accord was seen traveling on Highway 501 near 4 Mile Road. At 1:27, her vehicle arrived at a location called 41 Grocery and Grill in Mullins. At 2:54, Mica made the 911 call to the dispatcher from the state park. As investigators continued piecing the timeline, they uncovered additional context about Mica's personal life. They confirmed that Mica and her husband were estranged at the time of her death and were also involved in legal proceedings, shedding light on the divide between John Paul and Mica's family. Naturally, investigators also worked to confirm John Paul Miller's whereabouts. They determined that on April 26, the day before Mica's death, he had traveled to Charleston for a sporting event, verified through eyewitness accounts and license plate reader data. Detectives confirmed that he stayed overnight in the Charleston area, and on the day Mica died, he returned to Myrtle Beach. He was with other individuals while traveling. Law enforcement ultimately confirmed that he was not anywhere near Mica on the day before or the day of her death. So after reviewing the findings, Mica's family met with deputies to discuss the investigation. And at the same time, John Paul Miller asked the Robertson County Sheriff's Office to meet him in South Carolina instead. And the sheriff said no.
So from an investigative standpoint, Mica had suddenly and tragically taken her own life from pretty much out of nowhere.
So why is there still suspicion? Why are we still talking about this case today? To understand that, we have to go back. When Mica would later tell police about the timeline of her marriage, she would say that she and her husband had been separated since January of 2023, more than a year before her death. That was a major shift from this image that John Paul presented in May of 2024, that close, supportive marriage with the best wife anyone could ever ask for. Just 2 months before Mica's death, things escalated. In February of 2024, police reported that Mica had been involuntarily hospitalized for 48 hours. Later that same month, Mica told police she believed John Paul had fraudulently initiated that hospitalization.
Now that makes things interesting.
Then on February 21st, Myrtle Beach police responded to a report involving a stolen vehicle. The complainant was Mica. She told officers she had been separated from her husband since January of 2023. She explained that she had been hospitalized on February 8th, and during that time, her silver Honda Accord had been left in a Walmart parking lot on Walton Drive. And when she was discharged on February 10th, hospital staff informed her that John Paul had picked up her purse and her car keys while she was still hospitalized. After being released, Mica went back to that Walmart parking lot. Her car was gone, and she told police she believed John Paul had taken it. According to the report, she said she had known him since she was 10 years old and that he had groomed her while she was working for him at the church, leading up to their marriage in 2017. When police contacted John Paul, he told them they were not legally separated and that Mica suffered from mental health disorders. He described what he called episodes that he said happened annually, typically around Christmas. Now, according to the report, he told officers that during these times, she would stop taking prescription medication and she would become reckless, spend large amounts of money. He confirmed that he had the vehicle and told the police he wouldn't return it for about a month, which he claimed aligned with the time frame of Mica's episodes.
Annual episodes around Christmas. I mean, the framing there, it's almost clinical sounding. And it's the kind of thing that once it's in the police report, it becomes the lens that every future report about her gets read through.
Now, ultimately, police determined that because the couple was still legally married, the vehicle was considered marital property and no criminal charges were filed. By March of 2024, the situation had become even more complicated. Multiple police reports from this time period reveal a series of incidents involving financial disputes, allegations, and repeated calls to law enforcement. On March 13th, police documented a report involving an alleged embezzlement incident connected to Mica and John Paul's church. According to that report, there was an identified complainant who claimed that an employee of the church, identified by police as Mica, had been tasked with collecting donations for a nonprofit organization called Dare to Care Mission.
And those funds were intended for a mission trip to Kenya. Mica had been there and she talked about going back.
The complainant alleged that on February 14th, donation money from the church's Zelle and Cash App accounts was transferred into Mica's personal bank account at South State Bank. And they also claimed that cash donations had been collected and deposited directly into that same account, totaling $1,199. The report concluded by stating that an investigation would follow. On April 8th, detectives consulted with the city attorney and ultimately determined there was no probable cause to pursue criminal charges. John Paul himself was listed in that police report as an involved other.
And here's what the police report leaves out. According to Mica's attorney, Regina Ward, the couple had a postnuptial agreement drafted in February of 2024 that addressed Mica's role with the church, missions, and related bank account. That agreement was signed before the police report was filed against her.
And around that same time, additional police reports paint a very different picture, this time with Mica as the victim. On March 11th, Mica reported that a razor blade had been placed in her tire while she was at Spring Maid Pier. She told police that this was the second time within a week that something like this had happened. And according to the report, as she was leaving the pier, she heard a pop and discovered metal protruding from her tire. The responding officer noted that the object appeared to be a tire deflation device, something that could be purchased online. Mica told police that she suspected her husband was responsible. She had noticed what she described as strange activity and believed that she was being followed or watched. She also told officers her husband had a history of similar behavior toward her. However, police stated that there wasn't enough evidence to prove the suspect had placed the device.
So how did it get there, though?
Right. Later that same morning, another officer responded to East Coast Honda, where Mica had gone to get the tire repaired. And she told police that after leaving the pier, she stopped at a gas station where her husband pulled up next to her and tried to speak with her. Now, according to the report, she told him to leave her alone, and when she pulled out her phone to record the interaction, he reportedly drove away. But the situation didn't end there. She told police that when she arrived at the dealership, the same individual showed up again. While speaking with the officers at the dealership, Mica received a phone call from a no-caller ID number. The officer noted that the call was from the same individual she had identified as the suspect. The officer warned the individual, assumed to be John Paul, to cease contact and that further attempts could result in legal action. So after the officer left the scene, Mica contacted them again with another claim. Mechanics at the dealership had discovered a tracking device on her vehicle. The officer arranged to meet her to collect the device as evidence, and around the same time, Mica also reported that she was at the magistrate's office attempting to obtain a restraining order and that she was afraid for her life. While outside the magistrate's office with an officer, a vehicle slowly drove past them, and Mica identified the driver as the same individual she had been reporting her estranged husband. According to the report, the vehicle then sped away. By March 26th, a magistrate summons had been issued, and Mica and John Paul were both ordered to appear for a bench trial in a civil case where Mica was seeking a restraining order. The next day, John Paul filed his own harassment complaint. He told police that he was being harassed on social media and by text by his wife and her family. The officer looked at the Facebook post Mica had made. It talked about abuse. It didn't name anyone specifically. John Paul also had no text to show. The officer advised him to stop looking at her page.
So his evidence was a Facebook post that didn't name him. And hers was a tire deflation device pulled out of her car and a tracking device pulled out by a mechanic at the dealership. Those two situations are not even comparable.
Yeah, not comparable at all. The situation only seemed to escalate when Mica made a horrifying report at the beginning of April. On April 8th, Mica told police that a nude picture of her had been posted on Facebook by her estranged husband, who she said had her old phone and access to her old Facebook account. Mica explained that the photo had been posted on a Facebook page called Big Boobs and Nice Curves and tagged her old Facebook account that he had access to. Mica further told police that John Paul was the only person she had ever sent that type of photo to. The photo posted was one she had sent him 6 months earlier. Mica showed officers the photo that had been posted. Her breasts were exposed, but the most intimate parts were blurred. South Carolina's nudity code wasn't met. The post was anonymous. Officers told her there was nothing they could do.
Yeah, I mean, she had the photo. She sent him the photo, so she knew who posted it. And the law said that it was technically not nude, so the case was closed.
Now, here's something else that's interesting. According to the preliminary report from the North Carolina Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Mica had been prescribed anti-anxiety medication 2 days before her death. The report cited medical records documenting 2 prior psychiatric hospitalizations, one in November of 2022 and one in February of 2024. The second one was an involuntary commitment. The records listed bipolar 1 and suicidal ideation in her history.
Involuntary commitment. Let's just take a second on that. Being committed in this sense means a person is held in a psychiatric facility against their will because somebody else has petitioned the court to say this person is a danger to themselves or others, or is so impaired they can't take care of themselves. The patient doesn't consent. They can't leave. They're legally detained, just in a hospital instead of a jail. And to get someone committed, you generally need to hold some kind of authority over them. A doctor's evaluation, law enforcement intervention, or in some cases, healthcare power of attorney.
Right. And the timing of when Mica was committed is the part of this case that we need to slow down on, because Mica had filed for divorce from John Paul once before. In October of 2023, Mica officially filed. According to her family's attorney, Regina Ward, John Paul convinced her to dismiss it. Then on February 8th of 2024, just a few months after she had tried to leave him, Mica was involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric facility. She was held for 48 hours.
So she tried to divorce him, he talked her out of it, and a few months later, she's locked in a psychiatric ward against her will.
That's the timeline. And the family's position on this is critical. Mica's family has stated publicly more than once that Mica had no documented history of mental health issues before her marriage to John Paul in 2017. Their position is that the diagnoses on Mica's medical record came out of a system John Paul was controlling, not out of any organic illness.
So you may be thinking, how does one person control the medical narrative of another adult? Mica seems pretty healthy from what we described at the beginning of this episode. Well, the family alleges that during their marriage, John Paul had a level of involvement in Mica's medical decisions that gave him significant influence over how her care was handled. According to attorney Regina Ward, that influence is part of why, when Mica was committed in February of 2024, the family questioned whether the process had been initiated for her benefit or for his.
Because like you said, Ricky, the way involuntary commitment usually works is somebody initiates the petition, and this could be a doctor, a family member, law enforcement, or somebody with legal authority over the patient. A clinician then evaluates the person and signs the admission paperwork, and the medical record names the admitting clinician. In Mica's case, the medical examiner's report says she was admitted by a therapist. But the person who sets the process in motion isn't always the person who shows up on paper.
And once she's inside, the doctors are working with whatever account they were given by the person who brought her in. So if the husband, the one who has power of attorney, tells the intake team she's suicidal, she's stopped her medicine, she's having an episode, that's the framing the staff is working from.
Yes. And here's what Mica did when she got out. She was discharged on February 10th. The hospital staff told her that while she was committed, John Paul had come by, picked up her purse and her car keys, and when she went to go retrieve her car from the Walmart parking lot where she had left it, the car was gone.
Yeah, so he took her car while she was locked up.
And that's what the police report says. And on February 21st, less than 2 weeks after she had been released, Mica filed a police report stating that she believed John Paul had fraudulently initiated her involuntary hospitalization and had stolen her car while she was receiving treatment.
So her position on the police record was that he had her committed under false pretenses.
Yes. And once she was out, she didn't go back to him. On March 11th, 2024, Mica filed for a restraining order against John Paul, and a bench trial was held on March 26th. And on April 25th, 2 days before her death, Mica had John Paul served with divorce papers for the second time and filed additional restraining order paperwork.
First, divorce filing in October, talked out of it, committed in February, discharged from the hospital, immediately files a police report against him, restraining order in March, hearing in March, second divorce filing April 25th, and then 2 days later, she's dead.
Yep, this is the documented timeline.
And while all of this was happening, John Paul was the one publicly framing his wife as the one who was mentally unwell. He's the one who, in his sermons, told the congregation about her diagnoses. He's the one who, after her death, told reporters that 7 doctors said his wife needed medication. But John Paul has openly described his own mental health treatment from the pulpit. In sermons in late 2023 and again in early 2024, he told the congregation he was taking lithium, that he was seeing a psychiatrist, and that he was struggling with anger and unforgiveness. In one sermon, weeks before Mica died, he told the congregation he hated his life. So this is the same guy that's running the narrative about how Mica is unstable, and he's the one with the psychiatric medication on record. He's also somehow power of attorney over a woman who tried to divorce him and take out a restraining order against him. It really just doesn't add up.
Yeah, it just so happens to be that 2 days after she had served him with divorce papers, Mica was dead. By the time April 2024 arrived, the social fortress of their church and the polished image of a pastor's wife had been replaced by accusations and fear. As the investigation continued, the situation surrounding Mica's death didn't quiet down. If anything, it grew. In the days following the release of the timeline, Solid Rock Church made an announcement regarding John Paul's pastorship, saying that he had been released from his ministerial duties, at least temporarily, for what they described as a time of healing, counsel, and guidance. And at the same time, the church's website was taken offline. Meanwhile, the Robertson County Sheriff's Office announced that they had requested assistance from the United States Attorney's Office and from the FBI in South Carolina. Meanwhile, the Robertson County Sheriff's Office announced that they had requested assistance from the United States Attorney's Office and from the FBI in South Carolina. According to their statement, they had actually been in contact with both agencies since the early stages of the investigation. But based on the information gathered and jurisdictional factors, they formally requested additional assistance. They didn't release further details, but they did ask that anyone with information related to the case to contact the FBI office in Columbia, South Carolina.
Following that announcement, Mica's family released a statement of their own, expressing gratitude to those supporting the push for justice, but clarifying that they had no personal knowledge of the nature of any FBI involvement.
And as the investigation continued, more information began to surface through court documents, police reports, and statements from Mica's family. In affidavits filed on May 2nd, Mica's siblings Sierra Francis and Nathaniel Francis described what they believed to be a pattern of abuse and fear leading up to Mica's death. According to Sierra, Mica had expressed concerns for her safety during the couple's divorce proceedings. At one point, Mica had told her sister that if she ended up with a bullet in her head, it was JP. In that same affidavit, Sierra stated that Mica had told family members and others that she was experiencing abuse and violence within her marriage. She also claimed that Mica believed she was being followed and that her husband had hired people to track her movements. The affidavit further alleged that during a time when Mica was receiving mental health treatment, JP transferred assets, including the deed to their home, and removed her personal belongings. In March of 2024, just weeks before her death, Mica had posted a series of videos to her Facebook page. Over the course of 10 days, she shared messages of encouragement, faith, and personal strength. But within those messages, she said that the people watching didn't have to stay in an abusive relationship, whether that was physical, psychological, or someone making them feel like everything is their fault. There was also an earlier incident reported in November of 2023 when Mica was staying with her sister, who called 911 after receiving what she described as threatening text messages from JP. According to the call, he allegedly sent text messages telling her to leave her sister's house or there would be hell to pay, and things like blood are going to be on her hands. Sarah also told dispatchers JP was threatening suicide and was concerned he might show up at the house. At one point, he allegedly responded by saying to call the cops and that he was armed and ready.
Call the cops. I'm armed and ready. That's a text sent in the middle of a 911 call about him.
Yeah, I mean, from Mica's perspective, how frightening would this be?
Yeah, I mean, let that sink in.
From this, it looks like Mica was relentlessly stalked. In February, John Paul utilized a common tactic in power struggles, pathologizing Mica. By labeling her behavior as annual episodes, he was able to legally justify taking her vehicle and dismiss her reports of harassment as paranoia. So even when an officer caught what people assumed was JP for following her to the magistrate's office, the legal threshold for a restraining order felt impossibly high, leaving Mica to fight for her life in a slow legal system. Every time she went to the police, she heard that it was a civil matter or that there wasn't enough evidence to respond. John Paul managed her reputation, turning her into this unreliable witness to her own life. By the time she was reporting being afraid for her life, the stacked deck against her already made her look like the problem instead of the victim. I mean, everything that was done to her was just an inch away from anything criminal. So Mica was left to take care of herself against someone who, according to sources, relentlessly tormented her.
And there's a name for what people are describing here. It's called coercive control. And what it does when it's applied long enough is replace someone's own will with the will of the person controlling them through threats, through tracking, through sabotage of every part of their life. The perpetrator never has to pull the trigger. The victim ends up convinced there's no other way out. And it works fastest when the victim is already vulnerable. Nobody in this case is saying that JP physically killed Mica. What they're saying is that her suicide may not have been entirely her own choice.
In response to the growing allegations, JP's attorney issued a public statement. In it, he denied all claims of abuse, called the accusations unfounded, and stated that rumors circulating in media and online were false. JP refuted any suggestion that he was involved in Mica's death. In South Carolina, stalking charges require a pattern of harassing conduct, not a single isolated incident. Mica had filed multiple complaints in the months leading up to her death.
Multiple complaints, multiple departments, and nothing happened.
In response, Michael's supporters began calling for change. A former member of Mica's church launched an online petition advocating for what she called Mica's Law. The goal was to push for stronger protections for victims of stalking and harassment. Within a short period of time, the petition gained tens of thousands of signatures, along with messages from others who said they had experienced similar situations. On June 5th, 2024, attorney Regina Ward held a press conference. She publicly called on the South Carolina legislature to revive a coercive control bill that had been sitting in committee, untouched, since 2020, and she proposed it be renamed Mica's Law. The proposal was built around what Ward called Mica's List, a collection of behaviors drawn from Mica's own journals, personal writings, and verbal accounts. According to Ward, the list outlined patterns of what she described as abusive, coercive control.
A coercive control bill had been buried in South Carolina Senate Judiciary Committee for 4 years. Filed in 2020, refiled in 2021, never moved out of committee. The chair of that committee was, and still is, Senator Luke Rankin of Conway.
And it would take almost a year for Ward's call to result in actual legislative action. On April 22, 2025, State Senator Stephen Goldfinch of Murrells Inlet filed a new version of the bill, and it was later refiled as Senate Bill 702, co-sponsored by Goldfinch and Senator Larry Grooms of Bono. Goldfinch had been contacted by at least a dozen women, including former classmates, who shared their own experiences. In December of 2025, he pre-filed a revised version that expanded the definition of household member to include people in current or former dating relationships, and added harassment, stalking, and coercive control as forms of abuse to be considered in divorce and child custody decisions.
The bill carries up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. It defines coercive control as a repeated pattern of behavior used to dominate, isolate, or manipulate a partner. Things like isolating someone from family, monitoring their finances, threatening to share private information or photographs, tracking their movements.
Every one of those behaviors appears somewhere in the public record of what Mica reported in the months before her death. That same day in June, some of Mica's personal belongings, which had been in the custody of the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, were released to her family's legal team. This came after an agreement was reached between attorneys representing both Mica's family and her estranged husband. The agreement was finalized just before a scheduled hearing in Horry County Family Court, which was canceled as a result. One of the key items discussed was the vehicle Mica had driven to Lumber River State Park, which was not legally owned by Mica, but instead titled to her godmother, who retained possession of it under the agreement. In a series of court filings, JP pushed back against actions being taken by Mica's family, including a request to block a posthumous name change.
Yeah, more evidence of control even after she was gone.
At the same time, additional claims were introduced in court filings related to Mica's estate, including allegations of collusion between JP and his church to undervalue properties and prevent Mica from receiving what her family believed would have been her fair share in the divorce. The agreement also included multiple restraining orders, but the specific details were not made public. By July of 2024, the case had reached a point where nearly every detail was being publicly debated. Mica's family and friends continued to speak out, pushing for justice and raising concerns about what they believed led to her death. And for the first time, JP spoke publicly. In an interview, John Paul addressed the people who believed he was responsible, and he didn't hold back. He said they were the biggest idiots on planet Earth. He said he was actually the only one not to blame and the only one who had tried to keep Mica alive. He claimed that he warned dozens of people, including her family, that Mica needed to stay on her medication and shouldn't have access to a firearm. According to him, others had that information and failed to act. Throughout the interview, JP described Mica's struggles as rooted in mental health. He said multiple doctors, nurses, and counselors had advised that she needed medication and that without it, she was at risk of harming herself. He described what he called cycles, periods where she would act impulsively, followed by periods where she would withdraw and express suicidal thoughts. He also stated that disagreements between him and Mica's family often centered around her need for medication. When asked directly about allegations of abuse, JP denied them completely. He said there was never any form of abuse, physical or otherwise. He described himself as someone who took care of Mica in every aspect of her life, saying she didn't have to work, cook, or clean, and that his role was to support her and ensure she stayed healthy. He also claimed that he was protecting her from what he described as abusive people who he believed were interfering with her treatment. Another major point of concern was Mica's reports of tracking devices on her vehicle. In the interview, JP acknowledged the tracking, but he offered an explanation. He said that he hired a private investigator to alert him if Mica went near a gun store. The tracking, he said, was meant to keep her safe.
18 months later, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of South Carolina would say that's not what happened. Per the federal indictment, JP hired the investigator to cyberstalk Mica for alleged adultery, not to protect her from buying a gun, to track her, the exact thing she had been telling the police he was doing for over a year.
When asked about Mica's family pushing for legislation, JP dismissed their claims of coercive control, saying they wanted money and fame and that they would do anything for money. He also denied specific accusations, including isolating Mica from her family or threatening to expose private information. However, he did acknowledge at least one incident, where he said he had threatened to share photos of her during an argument. As the interview closed, JP shared how he wanted Mica to be remembered, saying she loved her church deeply and described her as being someone who cared about her faith and her marriage. At the same time, he criticized those protesting outside the church, calling them disruptive and saying they misrepresented what Mica valued. By the end of July of 2024, after months of public tension, legal disputes, and growing attention, Mica's family and John Paul reached an agreement to end all ongoing legal disputes. They also made a joint call to ask protesters to stop demonstrating outside John Paul's church. Attorneys announced that a global settlement had been reached following a probate court hearing. The terms of the agreement were kept confidential, including decisions regarding Mica's estate. Months later, in November of 2024, a day-long event was held to honor Mica's life. It brought together the things that defined her love of music, her community, and her faith. Her sister Abigail spoke about what the moment meant, saying Mica would have been so excited to see so many people come together in her honor. Among those participating was the Sacusty High School band, where Mica had once attended. But even as the community gathered to remember Mica, the controversy surrounding the case hadn't fully faded. On November 1st, the FBI conducted what it described as court-authorized law enforcement activity at JP's home. Very few details were released. 5 days later, on November 6th, JP was arrested in Myrtle Beach, but not for anything relating to Mica. It was in connection to an alleged assault involving a protester outside of his church. There was conflicting statements as to what really happened. JP was arrested and released on a $776 cash surety bond. His lawyer strongly denied the allegations, calling the arrest unjustified and claiming JP was being harassed by protesters.
Regarding the FBI search, detectives said back in May that there was absolutely nothing connecting JP to Mica's death. So speculation was high about why a federal agency was searching his home.
And from there, JP's reputation only fell further. In February of 2025, a civil lawsuit was filed in Horry County, South Carolina, accusing John Paul Miller and his father, Reginald Wayne Miller, of long-term sexual abuse and predatory behavior. The complaint, spanning more than 40 pages, was filed by a woman identified as Jane Doe. According to the lawsuit, the woman alleged that JP sexually assaulted her as recently as 2023 during a trip to Myrtle Beach. She claimed that during the encounter, he hugged her and touched her inappropriately without her consent. The lawsuit also alleged that the incident triggered memories of a prior assault, which she said occurred about 25 years earlier when she was 15 years old and the man was 19. The complaint went further, alleging that both JP and his father had operated within a system of misconduct that occurred over decades. It named multiple church organizations and previous iterations of ministry, including All Nations Cathedral Church, Cathedral Baptist Church of the Grand Strand, and Solid Rock Ministries. The lawsuit claimed they failed to implement safeguards to protect minors. According to the filing, there were no sufficient protections in place, no background checks, no supervision policies, and no reporting protocols, which allows abuse to go unchecked.
A quick thing on John Paul's father, Reginald Wayne Miller. Because he's named all the way through these lawsuits and he has his own history, in 2014, federal investigators arrested him for forced labor at Cathedral Bible College in Marion, where he was president. The affidavit alleged he was making foreign students work full-time at his school and at his home, while threatening to revoke their student visas if they complained. They were paid around $50 a week. The campus had stretches with no hot water, no heat, no air conditioning. Food was reportedly expired or lacking. He pleaded guilty in 2015 to fraud in foreign labor contracting, visa fraud, and wage and hour violations. 8 years before that, in 2006, he was charged with lewdness and prostitution after exposing himself to an undercover officer in a bathhouse at Myrtle Beach State Park. That charge was expunged through pretrial intervention.
And keep this in mind, this is the same man named alongside John Paul as a defendant in the Jane Doe lawsuits. 8 days later, after the first lawsuit, on March 5th, 2025, a second woman, identified as Jane Doe 2, filed her own complaint against John Paul, his father, and the same network of religious organizations. The complaint describes the school as not being a real school. It alleges classes were held in a repurposed bowling alley, no certified teachers, no legitimate coursework.
The plainest words are that it was a trap.
The lawsuit alleges that during her time there, John Paul sexually assaulted her, and when she reported it to a teacher, the lawsuit says she was sent to Reginald Wayne Miller's office, where John Paul was already waiting, and this is his dad. Reginald, according to the complaint, demanded she repeat the accusation in front of his son, then yelled at her, "You will not lie about my son." The lawsuit says she was punished by being forced to write the phrase, "I will not lie about John Paul Miller," 5,000 times.
5,000 times by a 14-year-old, as discipline for reporting that her teacher had touched her.
And at 16, the lawsuit alleges that she brought a Harry Potter book to school. Reginald and John Paul allegedly pulled her into a meeting, called her a servant of Satan, told her that if she continued down this path, she would, in their words, be raped by demons.
I mean, it's Harry Potter. Come on.
Yeah. And the complaint says they burned the book in front of her. Reginald is alleged to have beaten her with the Bible and poured water over her head. After that, she stopped attending the school.
Both Jane Does say the same thing about how the memories come back. They watched the coverage of Mica's death and it all resurfaced.
Around the same time as the Jane Doe lawsuits, John Paul's first wife, Allison Williams, filed emergency court documents seeking to keep John Paul and his father away from her own children. According to those filings, Allison stated that John Paul had admitted to her during their marriage to having engaged in several sexual relationships with minors.
His first wife, on the record, saying he told her while they were married that this had happened.
And everything starts coming to the surface. And in March of 2025, JP and his father filed a counterclaim in court, formally denying every allegation made against them. According to the counterclaim, all the claims were false, and each was expressly denied. But the response didn't stop at denial. The Millers accused Jane Doe of defamation, alleging she had made the accusations publicly, including on social media, and that those statements had spread across platforms, amplifying harm to their reputations. According to the filing, those statements were false, unsubstantiated, and intentionally damaging.
The counterclaim also asked the court to intervene, seeking an injunction that would require Jane Doe to stop making what JP described as defamatory statements and to remove any statements that had already been made. In addition, the filing sought damages, including compensation for harm to his reputation, as well as legal costs and attorney fees. That case, as far as we know, is ongoing.
And the Jane Doe counterclaim wasn't an isolated case. John Paul has filed close to 36 civil lawsuits against protesters and former church members, seeking protection orders and damages. The people he sued have said publicly that the lawsuits are retaliatory, designed to intimidate them into silence. One of those cases went all the way to a jury trial. In August of 2025, John Paul took a former Solid Rock band member named Sam Rickman to court, alleging Rickman had harassed him with online posts. Rickman, represented by Mica's family attorney, Regina Ward, countersued. After hearing the case, the jury awarded John Paul $100 on his harassment claim. Rickman was awarded $3,400 on his.
$100. That's what the jury thought his harassment claim was worth.
And in the middle of all of this, on March 14th, 2025, the man who heard Mica's last cry was killed in a car accident.
Johnny Jacobs, the fisherman.
Right. If you remember him from earlier in the story, he was driving home in Robertson County, North Carolina, at the intersection of Iona Church Road and Raynham Road. Around 7:30 in the evening, a 2006 Mercedes traveling north on Raynham failed to stop at a posted stop sign and T-boned Jacobs' vehicle at 55 miles per hour. The car overturned. Jacobs was ejected and thrown roughly 25 feet. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The driver, a 54-year-old man from Chester, Virginia, named Winston Charles James, was charged with failure to stop at a stop sign and misdemeanor death by vehicle. The North Carolina medical examiner classified Jacobs' death as accidental.
That's the official ruling, but the people who had been following Mica's case from the beginning, the timing was hard to ignore. The man who heard her cry, the man who found her belongings gone less than a year later.
And Jacobs had told reporters that what he saw that day at the Lumber River had changed his life. He said if he had been able to see her, he would have tried to help. He said he had wished he had gone in there and checked on her. More than a year after Mica's death, John Paul Miller remarried. The ceremony took place in Myrtle Beach on June 1st, 2025, and it was described as a private event with a small group of attendees. According to reports, the ceremony included security with armed bodyguards present, and sources familiar with the situation claimed the timing of the wedding coincided with what they described as an escalation in federal investigation. What drew even more attention was his new wife Susie's past. Her previous husband, a man named Chris Skinner, a 41-year-old motivational speaker who was quadriplegic, had died in September of 2021. He drowned in a neighborhood swimming pool on Labor Day. His wheelchair had rolled into the water, and his death was originally ruled accidental. The Horry County Coroner's Office briefly reopened the investigation in March of 2025. In an affidavit filed in May of 2024, Allison Williams, JP's first wife, whom he divorced in 2016, stated that shortly before Chris Skinner's death, he had confronted JP about an alleged relationship with Susie. According to her affidavit, Skinner had asked JP to leave his wife and family alone. The affidavit described the situation as unsettling, noting that both spouses connected to the current couple had since died in separate suspicious incidents.
So at this point, no one is contesting the fact that Mica died by suicide. But why wouldn't she? After, according to her and her family, she had been groomed, abused, stalked, harassed, and tormented for years. Is suicide really your own choice, or is it the full result of the life that you've been forced to live? If someone had intervened more seriously after multiple police reports, would Mica still be alive today? That's what people are questioning based on all of this history, the accusations, and the evidence.
And by December of 2025, nearly 2 years after Mica's death, the case took its most significant turn. On December 18, 2025, a federal grand jury in Columbia returned a 2-count indictment against John Paul Miller. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of South Carolina, led by U.S. Attorney Brian P. Sterling, he was charged with cyberstalking and making false statements to federal investigators. Prosecutors alleged that from November of 2022 up until the day Mica died, John Paul engaged in a sustained pattern of harassment. That included repeated, unwanted communication. On March 11th, 2024, this is the day of the tire deflation device, the day that she was followed to the dealership, the day that she was followed to the magistrate's office, John Paul contacted Mica more than 50 times. And according to the indictment, his outgoing calls to her that day exceeded her call to him by at least 50.
And that's the day that everything happened, on March 11th.
Yeah, and they also alleged he tracked her, interfered with her finances, damaged her vehicle's tires, and posted a nude photo of her online without her consent. According to the indictment, when federal investigators questioned him about these actions, he gave false statements in response. Prosecutors specifically said JP denied damaging Mica's vehicle. The indictment laid out the evidence. He had purchased a tire deflation device online and had communicated with others about her car.
He told investigators 2 other things that turned out to be false. He claimed Mica had called him more often than he had called her on March 11th. The phone records say the opposite. He also told investigators no police officer had ever told him to stop contacting her. An Horry County police officer specifically told him to stop on March 11th, on the record.
Now, one thing we do want to be clear about, John Paul has not been charged with causing Mica's death. The North Carolina Medical Examiner's Office has consistently ruled her death a suicide, and the federal indictment does not contest that ruling. What the federal indictment alleges is that he stalked her, surveilled her, and harassed her in the months leading up to her death, and that he lied to investigators about those actions afterward.
This is not a murder case. This is a stalking and false statements case. And that distinction matters for what type of trial happens this summer.
If convicted, JP faces up to 5 years in prison for cyberstalking and an additional 2 years for making false statements, along with significant financial penalties up to a $250,000 fine. As more details emerge, investigators described what they believe to be a long-term pattern, outlining what they say was a 528-day period of torment. Mica's family attorney described the level of alleged abuse as jaw-dropping and indicated that additional charges could be possible depending on the outcome of the investigation.
Investigators continued speaking with witnesses, with some reports suggesting that the scope of the investigation may extend beyond just one person, which, given everything else, wouldn't surprise anyone.
So as of April 2026, the federal case against John Paul Miller is still ongoing. Court records show that after pleading not guilty at his arraignment in January, Miller was initially scheduled for a pretrial conference in mid-April, but that timeline shifted. His attorneys requested a delay, stating that newly released evidence from prosecutors was extensive, described as voluminous, and required additional time to review. The court granted that request, pushing proceedings further into the summer. Following his arraignment, Miller was released on a $100,000 unsecured bond. As conditions of that bond, he is required to wear an ankle monitor, surrender his passport, refrain from possessing any firearm, refrain from excessive alcohol use, and is barred from leaving South Carolina without permission from the U.S. Probation Office. As of now, the case is moving toward its next key phases. A pretrial conference has been scheduled with jury selection expected to follow. And at the same time, outside the courtroom, another effort is gaining momentum, the push for Mica's Law. In April of 2026, almost 2 years to the day from her death, Senate Bill 702 finally got a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing in Columbia. Mica's sister Abigail Francis stood in the front of the panel and said the lack of accountability over the years that allowed the bill to lapse was, in her words, detrimental and unforgivable, and that it could have saved her sister's life.
No vote was taken at that hearing, but it was the first time the bill had moved that far since it was originally filed in 2020.
Right. Although Senator Goldfinch has said publicly that getting the bill through both chambers before the session ends in May is unlikely. The crossover deadline already passed on April 10th, so realistically, if there's any major action, it could move in 2027.
3 years after Mica died, to get a bill named after her to a vote. If you're listening from South Carolina, your voice matters here. This is a moment where contacting lawmakers, sending emails, making calls, and sharing your perspective can directly impact whether this bill moves forward. For those living through situations involving control, fear, or abuse, laws like this can mean the difference between staying trapped and finding a way out. So if you're able to, visit the Justice for Mica is Coming Facebook page, which has instructions for contacting lawmakers.
Mica was 30 years old. She was a daughter, a sister, and a stepmother to 5 children. She had spent her life pouring everything she had into people around her. She had a heart for missions. She had been to Kenya. She wanted to open a school there. 2 days before she died, she served her husband with divorce papers. Her family says she was hopeful. She was scared. She told her sister on more than one occasion that if she ended up dead by gunshot, it wasn't going to be by her own hand. Yet on April 27, 2024, that's what happened.
And for the family she left behind, the question has never been whether she pulled the trigger. The question is, what was done to her in the months before that brought her to a parking lot in a state park with a gun she had bought that morning?
And that's the story the federal indictment is now telling. 2 years later, not the story of how Mica died, the story of the 528 days before she died, a pattern of stalking, harassment, and false statements. The kind of pattern that doesn't show up in a single police report. The kind of pattern that takes a federal grand jury to assemble. Mica saw it. She told her sister. She told her brother. She even told the police. She wrote it down in her journals. Until the system finally caught up to what she has been saying all along. Her siblings and those closest to her have continued to speak out, sharing her story, her words, and their concerns, determined to make sure Mica is remembered for who she was. Through social media, including the Justice for Mica Facebook page, her family continues to raise awareness, share updates, and advocate for answers.
They've also pushed forward Mica's law, which they hope will create lasting change. They've made it clear they don't want her story to fade. They want it to lead to awareness and to change.
If Mica's story moved you, there are a few ways you can support her family's work. You can sign the petition for Mica's Law and follow updates on the Justice for Mica Facebook page. If you live in South Carolina, you can contact your state senator and ask about the status of the Senate Bill 702, the Coercive Control Bill currently sponsored by Senator Stephen Goldfinch and co-sponsored by Senator Larry Grooms. We'll have direct links to everything in our show notes, and if you want to support us and keep episodes like this coming, you can grab some Crime Salad merch over at crimesaladpodcast.dashery.com. And if you want to listen ad-free, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/crimesaladpodcast. Links to everything will be in the show notes.
Thank you guys so much for listening.
Stay safe, everyone. Until next time.